So I'm always doing research of one sort or another, and I was digging through some old newsreels, and I came upon this newsreel that was entitled "West Point Sends Its Men to War, 1942." It's typical of the newsreels that were made for the home front during the war. It's full of patriotic fervor, but it also has sort of a dark undertone that really underlies the gravity of the times. Gone is the light-hearted, carefree spirit, they said, of peacetime graduation. And I wondered, what happened to these young men that the newsreel described as the cream of America's young manhood? Then I found that there is a memorial at the Academy, placed there by the class of 1942, that lists the names of 70, nearly 1 in 5 of a class of 374 cadets that graduated in 1942 who didn't come home from the war. One classmate wrote in the alumni newsletter, "Ask any member of the class of 1942 and you will find it unanimous in the feeling that many of our finest gave their all in the Second World War." The faces, young, vital, handsome, in the West Point yearbook called The Howitzer, are each accompanied by a short biography of what the yearbook committee thought of them, their activities at the Academy, what their fellow cadets remember, and their nickname. It contrasts with the memorials written by their classmates and printed in subsequent years in the alumni newsletter called The Assembly, trying to ensure that their friends of the long gray line would not be forgotten. Their lives and deaths also were often reported in newspapers, among so many other stories of young men off to and never to return from war. Few people worked as hard to graduate the point as Thaddeus Francis Gibbon from Yonkers, New York. He originally planned a career in traffic management, obtaining employment during the difficult years of the Depression at the Hastings-on-Hudson plant of the Anaconda Wire and Cable Company. He had a promising career, but in 1939 his older brother Stanley secured an appointment to West Point, and, the Assembly writes, Thad soon developed the bug. Securing an appointment was not a simple task for him. Initially rejected for physical reasons, he had to lose 30 pounds. He overcame color blindness, which also may have disqualified him, through lengthy study of yarn patches. High blood pressure was also an obstacle. The Assembly writes, frequent examinations at Army hospitals developed a circle of sympathetic friends amongst the medics who would put Thad to bed and bring him in under the wire. It's hard to find anyone who worked so hard to gain admission. But Thad managed by contacting a congressman whose appointments had all failed their physical examinations. He entered the academy on July 1st, 1937. 2 years later, his brother Stephen graduated #1 in his class. But Thad struggled at academics, and the Assembly writes, was handicapped by being the butt of jokes and jibes from those who found humorous and incongruous the comparison between Thad's position near the bottom of his class and his brother's position as #1 in his class. Despite hard work and long hours of effort, he failed a turnout exam in January 1939 and had to seek readmission, and to start again as a yearling, meaning his second year. Despite his struggles, a classmate wrote in the Assembly, he appreciated the dignity of the individual and maintained a relationship with the plebes, as with his enlisted men later, which won their respect and esteem. Thad married Miss Ruth Kierstead the day after graduation and went into the infantry. Owing to a desperate need for junior officers, he was sent to England in December of 1943 and assigned to the 47th Infantry Regiment of the 9th Infantry Division. Promoted to captain, he was put in command of an anti-tank platoon. On June 18, 1944, Captain Jubin's battalion was being sent on a night mission 5 miles through enemy lines to cut off the Cherbourg Peninsula. As the route taken by the foot elements were impossible to motor vehicles, Jubin was reconnoitering a route that his guns could take. The Yonkers Herald-Statesman reported Jubin had penetrated on an inspection trip 2 miles into territory just evacuated by the enemy when a German bomber zoomed overhead and killed the young officer instantly. His commanding officer reported that he had found a route by which his guns could join the battalion. They were brought up by his platoon sergeant, where they were instrumental in enabling the battalion to accomplish its mission. He said of Jubin, he was by far the outstanding lieutenant in the regiment. I was very fond of him. When Ruth received the notification from the War Department, she initially had hoped that it was a mistake. The Assembly explains. Thad, ever solicitous of his loved ones, had in advance sent off letters dated the 19th and 20th of June, attempting to allay their invasion worries by telling them of supposedly dull duties in England. The class of 1942 was the first class in which U.S. military academy cadets could be commissioned directly into the U.S. Army Air Forces, and almost half chose that route. It was dangerous work. Far more than half of the cadets who died in the war were pilots. The U.S. Army Air Forces suffered 52,173 combat casualties during the war. By some estimates, bomber crews had a less than 50% chance of completing the number of missions required to complete their tour. Kenneth Earl Dyson of Kentwood, Louisiana, had already enlisted in the Army Air Forces before being appointed to West Point. The Shreveport, Louisiana Times reported on May 20th, 1938, that Private Dyson, then assigned to Louisiana's Barksdale Field, was the principal appointment from Louisiana this year of Senator Allen Ellender. The Assembly noted, from the first day he knew that his future lay in the U.S. Army Air Corps. He'd already tested the life in the elite service and had not a thought of another. A classmate wrote of him in the Assembly, most of us were pretty raw material as plebes. Ken exhibited from his first days as a cadet the manners and actions of a gentleman and a soldier. Very early he became deservedly and affectionately known to us as Sarge. The Howitzer offered, we all join in wishing him clear sailing and happy landings for the rest of his career. While training, he met and married Helen Matusik of Holyoke, Massachusetts. The Assembly notes they had just a few happy months together before he left for duty in the Pacific Theater with the 538th Bomber Squadron, 380th Bomb Group. The Imede City, Louisiana Tangy Talk reported that Dyson had been awarded the Air Medal in May of 1945 in recognition of meritorious service in the South Pacific, and soon after was transferred to the Philippines, made commander of an air squadron, and promoted to the rank of major. Helen received a letter from Colonel Forrest Brizzy, commander of the 380th Bomb Group. As a pilot, Kenneth was in the lead plane on a bombing mission against Toshin Formosa on 12 July 1945. His plane was hit by anti-aircraft artillery fire, and he immediately headed his plane out to sea, where rescue was probable. Approximately 20 miles off the coast of Formosa, he ordered his crew to parachute. A member of his squadron wrote, from all we can learn, Dyson was injured badly by the flak, but still flew the airplane. The Greensburg, Louisiana St. Helena Echo wrote, he piloted his plane out to sea and ordered the crew to parachute, making possible the rescue of 7 of the 10 men. The B-24 that he was piloting was called, ironically, Be Comin' Back. A classmate wrote in the Assembly, Ken was one of our finest. West Point without him would have been a lesser experience. Perhaps it is not too much to presume that somehow and in some measure the character and personality that was Kenneth Earl Dyson has been transmitted through his classmates to others. William Hampton Edwards of Ironton, Ohio, was studying engineering as part of the Reserve Officers Training Program at Ohio State University when he received his appointment to West Point. While at the academy, he met and started dating Mary Woodward Pierce, a student at nearby Vassar College. Following graduation, he went to flight training school in South Carolina and Georgia. He graduated advanced flying training on December 7, 1942. Owing to the anniversary, it was called the Victory Class. He and Mary were married on Christmas Eve. He was transferred to an operational training unit at Hamilton Field, California, in January of 1943, and started training new pilots to fly the Republic P-47. He and Mary welcomed a daughter, Susan, that June. He shipped out to the ETO in August of 1944 and flew a P-38 with the 49th Fighter Squadron of the 14th Fighter Group of the 15th Air Force. He received 2 air medals for his flying. On November 26, 1944, he was flying a deck-level strafing mission near Székesfehérvár, Hungary, when he was shot down by anti-aircraft fire. Upon hearing the news of his death, an elder cousin said of him, I think he was the finest of his generation in our family. Bill Edwards was 27. At the time of his death, Susan was 17 months old. The Assembly insists that no one ever called Charles Campbell Adelson Charles. Even that simple, unpretentious name seemed too austere to suit his warm, expensive personality. Chuck was born in Canada to an American father and Canadian mother who had met during the Great War when he was a captain in the American Expeditionary Force and she was a French nurse. With this background, the Assembly opined, it was natural enough that Chuck should desire to enter the United States Military Academy. After receiving his wings at Luke Field, Arizona, he went on to be what the Assembly describes as one of the most valuable flyers of the 359th Fighter Group. He was given command of a group of volunteers for a special strafing squadron called Bill's Buzz Boys. An account of the group, written in England, described the 24-year-old West Pointer as one of the most expert flyers of the 359th and a flight leader of long service. The Bridgewater, New Jersey Courier News reported his first aerial victory in May of 1944. The same month, on May 25th, Bill was shot down, bailing out over northwestern France. He was aided by the French resistance and escaped capture. At the academy, he had been known for whittling, and a member of the Maquis who sheltered him later said, "He peeled potatoes like a demon." He made it back to England after 4 months and resumed flying. On February 9th, 1945, he was flying a precarious escort mission when at approximately 1:20 p.m. his P-51 Mustang headed to strafe a locomotive just north of Gotha, Germany. His plane was not sighted again. Just 25 years old, he had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters, the Air Medal with 4 oak leaf clusters, the Distinguished Unit Badge, and was awarded the Purple Heart posthumously. Byron Albert Evans was an Army brat, the son of an Army colonel and chaplain who served during the Great War. The Howitzer mentions that By, as he was called, was the domestic type, with a slow, sly humor. Choosing flight school, he was sent to Moorfield, Texas, after earning his wings. There he met a base employee, Mary Patricia Lohr of McAllen, Texas. By and Pat were married on February 5th, 1943. Assigned to the 360th Fighter Squadron of the 350th Fighter Group, stationed in Suffolk, he flew more than 50 missions with the squadron, flying the P-47 Thunderbolt that he named Pat. He eventually earned the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. Promoted to captain in 1943, the Assembly writes, in spite of the fact that he was nearing the end of his operational tour, By remained eager as ever, giving his utmost to his duty. He flew 2 missions over France on September 11, 1944. On the second mission, he pursued a German Bf-109 into cloud cover. He was never seen again. As his tour was coming to a close, he had written to Pat that he was looking forward to the end of the war, when, with a bottle of beer in his hand and a pipe in his mouth, he could swap war experiences. Evans was not the only member of his class to die so close to going home. Joseph Richard Elliott of Wilmington, Delaware, had been, the Wilmington News Journal reported in June 1938, an honor roll member in various schools since the 4th grade. The Assembly notes that the years at the Academy came easily to Dick, and the Howitzer notes that he had a passion for practical jokes. He bore an interesting distinction for his class, being the first to acquire a wound stripe after being stationed in front of a rifle that was thought to be unloaded. The Academy had relaxed the rule that previously prevented cadets from marrying before graduation was finished, and he was one of 26 cadets to be married in the West Point Chapel on graduation day to Miss Alice Elizabeth Walker. He received his wings in the Army Air Forces the following December. Dick Elliott shipped out to Italy in August 1944. Alice was 8 months pregnant at the time. He was assigned to the 71st Squadron of the 1st Fighter Group, where the Assembly writes, a P-38 became his home away from home. Combat missions became his life. There he was promoted to major and completed 28 missions, earning 4 air medals. The Assembly writes, in the early months of 1945, the world knew that the Axis powers had been broken, but combat missions still had to be flown, and brave men still had to die to make the attainment of a just peace a living reality. So it was that Major Joseph Rochard Elliott kept flying into the German heartland. He left on a mission over Munich on April 13, 1945. He did not return. He was killed in action just 3.5 weeks before the end of the war in Europe. His son, Richard Rodney Elliott, born in September of 1944, never met his father. It is sometimes difficult to grasp the tragedy of war, even for those who never made it to the battlefield. John Ott Sanders Dameron was born March 20th, 1920, in Williamson, West Virginia, the son of Leola Sanders Dameron and Judge James Dameron, a U.S. attorney for the Southern District of West Virginia. According to the Assembly, when Sanders was a little boy with bright brown eyes and a fresh scrubbed face, playing soldiers with his father's big sword, singing solos at Sunday school, and getting into mischief as soon as church was out, he announced in his strong, clear voice, which was always so eager to follow the dictates of his quick mind that the S's came out like a whisper, that soon as he grew up, he was going into the Army. And as soon as he grew up, he went into the Army. Some are born to be soldiers. His fellow cadets called him Sandy. They wrote of him in the Howitzer. Smarter than most, better looking than most, Sandy was one of those rare personalities who could make cadet life pay dividends. The Assembly wrote that he loved West Point with all his heart. After graduation, he received his long-dreamed-of goal to scale heaven, the Army Air Corps. While in flight training at the Ryan School of Aeronautics in California, he met and married Geraldine Stolz of Alamogordo, New Mexico. He trained on the P-38, which he insisted was the best plane in the air. He attended flight command school in Orlando and was promoted to first lieutenant. His parents said that Sandy found great happiness and real satisfaction in flying. On his last visit home, he talked about nothing but his work and his plane. He had no fear of death because he was supremely confident of himself and his plane. The assembly wrote, like most flyers, he was desperately anxious to be sent abroad so that he could see the real show and do the work for which he had been prepared. He never had the chance. A flight leader, he took a squadron up on a routine training mission near San Diego on August 18, 1943. The assembly explains. On the way back to the base, one of the planes in his squadron flew under Sanders. The pilot could not see the plane above him in the sun, and he climbed directly into it. The Hinton, West Virginia leader reported, Army interceptor planes banked and turned in the morning sun. Planes in combat maneuvers were no novelty to the 20,000 residents of Linda Vista, a federal housing project. 2 of the P-38s collided. The pilot of one bailed out. The other fell with his crippled ship. There was a splintering crash and an explosion. In a letter to Sandy's mother, a radioman at the Coronado base wrote, he could have jumped at 8,000 feet, but he rode his ship all the way down, trying to get control of it and keep it away from houses. But the plane was too damaged, and in a terrible tragedy, in the crash, 5-year-old Nicholas Schumacher, his 3-year-old sister Margaret, and 5-year-old Kathleen May Long were killed. The largest war in human history had a long reach. The assembly wrote about the death of Sandy, just 23 years old, although it could have applied to the 3 children as well. When a promising, unfulfilled life is taken, we search our souls and God for a reason. There is no reason. When just last month I published the first episode about the cadets of the class of 1942 who died in the Second World War, it occurred to me that I could not tell just some of their stories. I couldn't leave anyone out. I had to tell them all. And I'm committed to doing that. I'm committed to telling the stories of all 70 of these cadets, what happened to them. And thanks everybody who's continuing to watch this. I can never fully give them voice. Their actions are simply so much larger than my small voice. And of course, they're just a handful of the millions who died in mankind's deadliest conflict in history. But I can't tell all those stories, but I can tell these. And these deserve to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.